Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry P. Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Also at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network, check out the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, The Larry P. Arnn Show, and more, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Week 4 of my conversation here on the Hillsdale Dialogue. That's what the music means. With Dr. Daniel Toole, professor at Hillsdale College. All things Hillsdale are found at hillsdale.edu. We have been reading in this, The Republic of Plato, and we've been doing so carefully for 3 weeks. This is the 4th week. There's actually an introductory week as well in the series. Professor O'Toole, we are on page 45 of Alan Bloom's second edition. And I want to read a paragraph to get us started. Socrates says, "It looks to me as though the investigation we are undertaking is no ordinary thing, but one for a man who sees sharply. Since we're not clever men," Socrates says, "in my opinion, we should make this a kind of investigation if someone had, for example, ordered men who don't see very well to read little tiny letters from afar, and then someone had the thought that the same letters are somewhere else also, but bigger and in a bigger place. I suppose it would look like a godsend to be able to consider the little ones after having read these first, if, of course, they happen to be the same." Now, this is a very interesting setup. I had never realized it was there. I now go in to get my eyes checked every 4 months because the retina is stretched. And, of course, they play around with those letter charts, right? It would be much easier to read the small letters if you'd seen the larger letters first, correct?
Much easier, yeah. You could have a sort of image of the big words, and then you see it in a small version that's kind of blurry, but you'd be able to recognize it. It's a very funny setup to what's going on, and kind of fishy, frankly. And so I think to unpack it, we have to wonder whether this is entirely what Socrates is going to do. The suggestion is, in order to see justice in its proper place, ultimately in the soul, in order to see justice as it's conducive to the soul's well-being and its happiness, first justice must be seen in a big image of it, in something really big, and that's the city.
Why do you think that's tricky? I like that. That made sense to me, Daniel O'Toole. I will fully acknowledge that there's something that makes sense about saying, look, once you see order, healthy order in a big area like a community, you can apply as an analogy that kind of order to the soul. So yes, you can see, well, once the rational men should rule in the community in the same sense that the rational part of the soul should govern or rule. That's going to be a kind of a teaching of the Republic and a fundamental teaching, but it's also not entirely what all Socrates is up to. And maybe it's not, here's what I mean to say, it's not a difficult thing to see that. Socrates is going to explore political life in its full complexity. And so I think he's giving you this image to raise the fundamental issue of the character of the political community and our place in it. Because justice, after all, is the virtue of serving the community, of following its rules. Justice typically is a virtue connected to our obligations to the community. We're not just individuals, we're citizens, we're members of a community. So I think the real issue here is being just in some sense as an individual, is that lead us to serve the community? Or is there a correspondence between justice in the community and the well-being or good of the individual? That's, I would say, the real question here. That is the real question, but to me, it suggested, okay, if we're going to assess the United States
in 2024. Go up to 30,000 feet. Don't talk to me about what's going on inside the Beltway. Don't talk to me about the free zone in Seattle. Don't talk to me about rural Iowa. Show me the whole thing. And then we'll talk about whether or not it's a good system. Why your skepticism of this approach?
Well, I'm not skeptical of it. It's just there's the order of the soul and its parts and its character are similar to parts of a community, as Socrates is going to show. There are those who are more reasonable, those who are more spirited, but the soul is different. And I think I think Socrates just wants to bring out the fact that it's a question: what is the relationship between the good order of an individual and the good order of a community? Or more simply, what's the relationship between the common good and the individual good? Can they be aligned? Because the task that they're going to engage in here is a task to see if they can build a community that instills a genuine common good. That is to say, a community that fulfills the work of justice as we normally understand it. Justice is building or preserving a common good, and the individual working toward that. And then the question is such a good available? And does the individual who works toward that good, is he himself happy and satisfied? Is he reach his individual completion at the same time that he serves the common good, or he is committed or devoted to it? That is going to be, I think, the real issue here.
That is the real issue. Would you explain to people how he goes about it? Because to me, the beginning of the Republic is difficult, and then Socrates kind of brings it down to the level that even the dummies in the circle, Glaucon and Adiamatus, they can all understand. It gets very, very simple to break it down. We need a shoemaker. We need a farm. Explain, Daniel, what he's doing here.
Yeah. Well, what he does, he suggests that maybe we can see justice by thinking clearly about its origins and the origins of the political community. And in the process, then he's gonna start to raise the question of, why do we have politics? Why are we in communities in the first place? Now, it turns out you're not going to simply be able to see justice simply in the origins of a community. You're going to have to see a fully just community develop before you can start to think fully about justice. But in thinking about the origins of the community, you can think through why we are political and why there's politics. And one of Socrates' basic suggestions here is politics originates in the fact that human beings are fundamentally needy. And we can't simply take care of ourselves. We need other people. And so there's a certain kind of economic origin to any political community. In fact, it doesn't make sense for each of us to try to do everything, every craft, every skill, every art to take care of himself. It makes sense for us to organize our lives in community where there's a kind of specialization and division of labor, where some people do the trading, some people make the shoes, some people do the farming, and then we trade and barter, and we all serve our needs accordingly.
It's all very seductive, but then he sticks in, Daniel.
Yeah.
And by the way, we're going to have a war. This is, to me, the great revelation of the second book.
Yes.
Oh, by the way, war is inevitable. It's just going to be part of humankind. And no one's looking for that, but it comes out of left field. And by the way, you're going to want your neighbor's land. And he's right.
And we're going to take it. You know, in other words, we're going to do something. We're going to commit what you might think of as a normal injustice that any community relies upon. We're going to need to establish our territory, which means taking land from others, from rival communities or, indigenous inhabitants. Yeah. So what we discover in this little thought experiment about the origins of the community is that we're not simply economic. We're not simply satisfied with serving our basic economic needs. What Socrates suggests, if you think reasonably about it, this sort of economic community that simply satisfies our basic natural biological desires is all we really need. And in fact, a reasonable arrangement would be one in which each man has the job or task that is right or fitting for him. And in that sort of arrangement, there doesn't seem to be much strife or conflict, but also, crucially, there isn't full-blown civilization. There isn't anything truly interesting. And frankly, some people are going to want more. So we're not just economic.
People who want more. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I'll be right back with Professor O'Toole. Don't go anywhere. The Hillsdale Dialogue will continue. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844.
Welcome back, America. Remember in Oliver Twist? Please, sir, may I have some more? We're talking about people who want more with Professor Daniel O'Toole of Hillsdale. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All of the Hillsdale Dialogues at Hillsdale at hughforhillsdale.com. Professor O'Toole, about those people who want more?
This is where Glaucon comes roaring in, right? I want more. I want luxury. And so that's a source of war. But I would say this, more fundamental and more important, and this is a kind of complicated point, but I think it needs to be made. Glaucon is partly dissatisfied by the picture that Socrates paints of this, what he calls a healthy city, because he's dissatisfied because there's no toil or struggle. There's no need for a kind of justice that entails sacrifice and devotion. If you recall, in Glaucon's speech, what he had wanted Socrates to show him was that justice was conducive to happiness, but then he also thought maybe even something more than happiness that might involve sacrifice of happiness, a kind of noble or perfect good, meaning this. Glaucon speaks to that part of our nature that wants to commit as we say today, to commit ourselves to a cause, devote ourselves, struggle, and even be willing to sacrifice for some greater good. And we think that kind of noble, that kind of transcendent commitment, that in a way maybe is the greatest thing possible. And
you're being very noble. You're being very noble because when I read this 50 years later, after I read it for the first time, I think, oh, now I get it. This was all a setup to introduce why we have to be ready for war. The whole first book and the first two speeches of the book, too, is just a setup for why we need the Guardians. Am I wrong?
Well, yes. What we're going to see is there needs to be a place in the for men like Glaucon. And those men are normally the most interesting and the most dangerous kind of men. They're the men who normally rule and are in charge, and they're the type of men who are good at fighting and combat. And those men desire more than other men. They're more ambitious, and they sometimes satisfy those desires through luxuries and pleasures and taking from others and enjoying their women and so forth and taking their land and their riches. But also those men do tend to want a sort of noble commitment, a cause, something to fight for. Normally, when you have those kind of men and they're noble and committed at first, the community kind of degenerates, and those men then take advantage of and prey upon and take, the rest of the community that is an arm. That's a great danger in politics. So we need armed men. And then the question is, how do we get the armed men to serve and protect us without exploiting us in the end? Yeah.
And to me, that the whole thing is we're going to get to the recognition that there's going to be war and we're going to need the guardians. How do we train the guardians? Now, that's the term that's been used for as long as I've been reading this. Is it, in your view, a good translation of what he's looking for? Because the guardians don't always guard. The guardians sometimes take and oppress.
Well, maybe in normal communities they do. I think it's an excellent term. It's a good translation because guardian implies, as in my noble interpretation, something truly noble. You're there to safeguard and preserve the community, which is a just and good community. And it speaks to the fact that these men are going to have virtues, and they're going to have to struggle and sacrifice in a way that other men don't. But truly ambitious men, they kind of want that. If you're really ambitious and noble-minded, you want to be a guardian of the community, right? You want to be the kind of man who can fight for it when need be. You don't merely want to be somebody who looks out for himself or his economic goods. And that's certainly the kind of man Glaucon is. So if you're going to build a truly just community, you need to have a place for ambitious, noble-minded men like Glaucon. You're going to need to have a role or task for them. And it turns out what Socrates is going to suggest is this should be their entire job.
And hold it right there, Professor. We'll come right back. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All of our prior dialogues you can find at hughforhillsdale.com. And we're talking about assigning jobs right now and how Plato envisions that would happen in the perfect republic.
He suggested in a rational community, each of us have one job, right? Well, in an old traditional community, you had a kind of citizen militia. The aristocrats, the gentlemen, they're farmers. They have their own landed estates. They care for the farm. But then they also serve the community and fight if need be. But Socrates says, oh, no, we're not just going to do that. We are going to have a professional military. In other words, they're not going to be farmers. They're not going to be men who care about their property. They are going to be wholly committed to training for war. That's going to make them better warriors, but also it's going to make them much more dangerous and much greater threat to us. And so the question is then, how do we train this professional military not to threaten us? But why do you want a professional military, Socrates? Why isn't it enough to have a citizen militia? And here's where I think the rub really comes in. A professional military allows you to radically transform a community. And we know this, right? When you have revolutionary politics anywhere, what tends to happen is you have one armed class, military men who really dominate. And they, in the modern world, they modernize regimes, whether in Turkey or Russia and so forth. So you can do a lot. You can make a society more governed by bureaucracy or expertise if you have a professional military in charge. And I think that's where Socrates is going. So it's
I want to bring back for our audience who've been listening for a few weeks. I often ask Dr. Arnn, why did the French Revolution go bad and why did the American Revolution go good? And it's because the warrior class that took charge in France, named Napoleon, and the people who worked for him, had no interest in justice. And the warrior class that took charge in the United States, named George Washington and his people, had no interest in self-aggrandizement of power. Why did they diverge? To what do you attribute that, Professor O'Toole, that the French end up with Napoleon and we end up with Washington?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the problem in France was a failure to appreciate the limits of political life and a desire to realize, and this is what we're going to see in the Republic, a desire to realize a fundamentally rational society, a fully just society. And that entailed doing away with all of the institutions which were somewhat corrupt, somewhat unfair and unjust, the old hierarchy and displacing them. In America, by contrast, the American founders had a much greater appreciation for the pillars of civilization, which seems somewhat unfair, but are necessary to preserve if you're going to have order. So I would say it's the passion for justice, and then the sort of unleashing of pure violence and the building up of this sort of national military that's unstoppable that Napoleon had under him, without a sense of limitation. And so Napoleon seeks to build a world empire, and maybe it's a just world empire, but it leads to a lot of massive injustice in the process.
The Napoleonic Code is still with us. So let's go back. I don't want to get too far ahead of us. The training of warriors depends upon music and gymnastics. Would you we got about 10 minutes left in this week. Can you just explain what he means by music and gymnastics? Because it's going to lose a lot of modern readers.
Yes, right. Yeah, well, I mean, what he means is an education of the body and the soul, and music, and hence the theater and poetry has a critical role in any Greek society. I mean, it kind of binds the whole community together. So music isn't just what you listen to on the radio. It's religious. And it's the fundamental literature or poetry of the regime. So what we think of as a kind of liberal arts education, especially focusing on literature, that's what's meant by an education in music. So when they talk about music, they immediately turn to discussing Homer and the greatest poets in the Greek world. But what Socrates is going to suggest then is what we need to do is educate the souls of our guardians. If they're not going to prey upon us, they need to have a proper moral education. Now, and this is a funny thing that he starts to do. He says, we want to make these guys spirited but also gentle. Spirited and even cruel in fighting our enemies, and gentle, however, in how they treat their fellow citizens. And he suggests this makes them more philosophic. It brings us a crucial term, philosophy. Philosophic, like dogs. Dogs are philosophic, right?
That's it. The puppies.
They love what they know. They're masters, and they hate what they don't know. Intruders. Yeah, what you were going to say? You're going to ask something.
Well, that he brings up puppies and dogs, and he wants to use that to illustrate how we are all sort of savage, but even the savage dog has loyalty.
Yeah, and also that the dog, this noble puppy, which is obviously like a guardian, that makes sense, could also be philosophic. Dogs are philosophers because they love their owners and hate people they don't recognize. Well, that's clearly a joke, and you're supposed to kind of laugh about it. Like, well, no, that's crazy, right? Philosophers are interested in what they don't know. They want to study it. They don't just love or guard their own opinions and fight anything that seems alien. So Socrates, in this funny way, is starting to introduce a fundamental element of the political problem. How do you get spirited men to also be open to reason and philosophy, so that they're gentle, yes, but also you could argue for its own sake? Because I think what we're going to see is this: the perfectly just community that they're constructing is a community where everyone gets what's right for him or fitting for him, and that means somehow allowing us to exert or employ the virtues that we have, including the moral and civic virtues of a guardian or a fighter, but also the rational virtues. Socrates is going to see how far he can go in satisfying our rational nature. Now, the very few men are going to be wise men or philosophers, but can you get the community to embrace philosophy, and can you get the ruling elite to be rational and have quasi-philosophic views, more rational views, not traditional, and in the Greek context, you could say religious views that aren't simply rational. He's really driving towards seeing how much can you make this society fully just and hence fully rational as well. Hence, we're going to make the ruling elite guard dogs, but also dogs that are kind of philosophic. And that
now, Professor, we got to make sure we put this in before we run out of time. I read it. Yeah. I'm trying to read this in order that we are talking about it. And I kept looking for Socrates telling the brothers how you're going to distinguish between who's the farmer, the shoemaker, and who's the guardian. At what point? Did I miss it? Is it in book 2 where we segregate out the guardians and begin to train them differently?
I mean, it's a very passing comment in which he says we're going to have to identify their nature, and then we're going to attend to their rearing. So you could say the guardians, who are the guardians? They're the product of both nature and nurture. Later on, there's going to be more explicit discussion of this basic fact. This is a highly meritocratic society, and what that means is the rulers are going to be constantly looking at the young and trying to figure out who among the young are especially impressive and natural guardians, and giving them a unique education so that they can fully cultivate their virtue and be good guardians. But, they're paying very close attention to how intelligent they are, how tough they are. So all of that is something that the rulers are going to have to do in order to figure out who should be members of the ruling class in the future.
But does he tell us here when that begins? Does he give us any specifics about how to? Because, of course, our entire society is caught up with DEI and CRT and the idea that merit may not actually be meritorious, but in fact systemically biased in favor of a group who's always had privilege. So what does Socrates say about that?
Yeah, it's clear. The sort of process of looking at and studying the young starts from childbirth and on. I mean, from a young age, you're studying the youths to see who's fit for rule, or what the right job for each is, whether he should work in the arts and crafts or whether he should be a guardian, and trying to educate them accordingly. Yeah, Socrates' view is that true justice, and this is something Thrasymachus and the others all recognize, and we still recognize, is fundamentally meritocratic, meaning it shouldn't be simply the product of privilege or birth, but everyone should get the job or task that allows him to fully embody the virtues that he's capable of. But that means that the society is not going to have it's not going to be an egalitarian society with egalitarian outcomes. Rather,
he also says
very different.
Repeatedly that if you make a mistake early in the process of your craft, you will destroy what you are doing. So it seems to me that the stakes are very high from the beginning with young children, because if you make a mistake early in anything, it's going to bend the end product. Is he warning against making a wrong judgment as to character and ability at the beginning? Because I think we do that a lot in the United States.
We do that a lot. Yeah, he is. I mean, it's also, it's extremely difficult to do this perfectly. And the regime is going to attempt to make sure that its ruling class is always filled with those who are as he'll later say, silver and gold souled, those who are fit for rule and educated accordingly. And for various reasons, partly because we love our own and we're selfish and we want to attach ourselves to our own kids, this is going to break down. So the normal human family connections and sexual desires will eventually undermine this regime. It's impossible to get it perfectly, that you can cultivate a ruling class that only has members of the ruling class who have the best natures, and not to contaminate it, so forth. So it's a extremely difficult and ultimately impossible task.
Yeah, very impossible, but we'll come back to how one gets it done.
Hey there. Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back, America. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. And here on the Hugh Hewitt Show, we spend every Friday at this hour talking about things long-lasting, things that are important, and they're all collected at hughforhillsdale.com. And I go back to the first paragraph. He was approached by a slave boy and ordered to stop. So we obviously have slavery in this society. Does Socrates have a judgment on that? Because our framers clearly were blind to its evil.
I don't think the framers were blind to its evils. We could talk about that in another one, or my father-in-law can get into that. But no, but Socrates does think that, in a strict sense, maybe what's best for most men is a simple job, a task. It's basically, there are going to be a lot of craftsmen in the regime, artisans, who get a wage, but their work is basically slavish. And Socrates doesn't think that that's fundamentally unjust. Most men don't want to be guardians, aren't capable of, shouldn't be involved in political rule, and are better off just with one simple task that they can do and do very well. So there's a kind of case for building an interesting community on the basis of slavish labor. In fact, every community has some kind of slavish labor. And there's always some kind of exploitation. Any civilization, anything interesting is going to depend on that, I think, to some extent. The question is whether you give men the jobs that are best for them.
So, at the beginning of this, after 2 books, we're not going to have an egalitarian society in the Republic, and we're not going to have a society where freedom is particularly prized, are we?
No, it's not. It's not an egalitarian society, and it's not one that's free at all. Because when we're free, we can choose poorly or improperly. We seek property and jobs that aren't fit or right for us. I mean, this started very early on with the Cephalus example. Once you start to grant that the wise should be in charge, maybe the wise can determine for you what property you should have, what you should do with it, what the best exercise of your labor is. So it's an extremely rigid, but ultimately rational society. One always has to ask them, well, would you want to live here or not? And I think throughout, what we're going to see is this society is both a utopia and a dystopia. There's always going to be a case for everything Socrates introduces into the regime, including the rigid class system and the hierarchy within it, including the very unique education and the censorship and so forth. There's always a case for it. In fact, it always is necessary for bringing about a common good and bringing about a just society. But then we always are supposed to ask, but will we go along with this? Are the sacrifices too much? Is the sacrifice of my freedom to try out different jobs? Is the sacrifice of what I can read and think about, is that going to be too much? Are the labors, and then, as we're going to see, the communism, the destruction of the family, is all of this ultimately good? Well, I think we're going to rebel against some of the things that Socrates introduces, and we're meant to.
People should be kicking against the guards by the end of chapter 2, right? They should be recoiling a little bit.
They should be nervous about it, but you should entertain the possibility that here, finally, we are going to figure out how to build through education, through moral education that starts from early childhood and on, a ruling class that actually does the job it's supposed to do. That is, protect the people and not exploit the people. They're true guardians, and a ruling class of men who are naturally moral and rational. So Socrates, they moved from this city in which our economic needs are served, simply the true city, to a feverish and luxurious city. But pretty soon we're going to discover the city gets purged, and that means the guardians are supposed to have been made virtuous and moderate. Their attachment, their longing for luxury and other people's stuff and indulgence has been transformed to a love of beauty that is the beauty of the soul and the beauty of the community. So they're morally committed, ambitious men in that sense. And again, I think it's important that there's a part of this whole
idealistic regime that speaks to Glaucon. My teacher had this nice formulation, Tom Pangle, that Glaucon, he said, is the most important character in Plato's most important dialogue. And what's unique about Glaucon? He is he's an idealist. You're not going to understand human affairs if you don't understand the role of idealism in it and how it drives political life. Not exclusively, not at all, and not in most of us, but it's an important driver. The seeking for perfect justice.
He's Robespierre to me, Daniel O'Toole.
Exactly.
We'll talk more about that next week. He's not Washington, he's Robespierre, and that's a dangerous thing. That's it for this week's Hillsdale Dialogue. We're going to go into Book 3 next week, or maybe I'll reset it and tell you what we missed thus far. We're moving very fast, but we're also doing very well. Thank you, Dr. O'Toole. Thanks all of you for watching.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.